we'll now go to our next speaker, who is Kara Dansky. So Kara Dansky is a lawyer, feminist, public speaker, and author of The Abolition of Sex, How the Transgender Agenda Harms Women and Girls. She serves as the president of the US chapter of Women's Declaration International, and previously served on the board of Women's Liberation Front, WOLF. She started her law and policy career as a public defender and went on to serve as, among other things, executive director of the Stanford Criminal Justice Center, senior counsel at the ACLU Center for Justice, and general counsel at the District of Columbia Sentencing Commission. Dansky got her JD from the University of Peninsula Law School and her BA from Johns Hopkins University. And the title of Kara's talk today, what she's going to tell us about, is her new book, just published in the last couple of weeks, The Reckoning, How the Democrats and the Left Betrayed Women and Girls. So thank you so much, Kara, and over to you.
This is the cover of my new book, The Reckoning, How the Democrats and the Left Betrayed Women and Girls. So the book starts with a preface, which is a note to American Democratic women, and I'll read a little bit of that here today. And then it proceeds in 5 parts. The first part establishes the need for a reckoning. Part 2 is the victims. Part 3 is the perpetrators. Part 4 is the resistance. And then the afterword is a cautionary tale and a policy prescription for Democratic Party leadership. So this is the preface, a note to American Democratic women. American Democratic women, can we have a word, please? I grew up in a small town in southeastern Ohio called Athens, home to Ohio University. The town has a population of about 10,000, which roughly triples when the university is in session. Athens tends to run Democratic. Every presidential election, Athens County shows up as bright blue in a sea of red, though of course some political conservatives live there. There's a shop in Athens called Artifacts Gallery. My friends and I frequently shopped there as teenagers. It sells fun knickknacks, funky earrings, and cool t-shirts. Its current owner is a woman named Amy Mangano. One day in 2022, Mangano decorated the shop front with a bunch of posters carrying messages that were all very pro-woman, pro-gay, and pro-free speech. In response, the community largely turned on her, calling for boycotts and protests. These calls were not coming from conservatives. They were coming from university students and progressives. Why? Why on earth would a bunch of university students and political progressives target a female small business owner who was spreading messages that were unambiguously pro-woman, pro-gay, and pro-free speech, traditionally progressive causes? The best way to explain it is that the Democratic Party, the left-leaning media, and the entire leftist political and cultural establishment have all betrayed and abandoned women and girls at the altar of, quote, gender identity, or, quote, trans. By the entire leftist political and cultural establishment, I include traditionally progressive organizations like the American Civil Liberties Union, or ACLU, where I once worked, and celebrities like Jamie Lee Curtis and Charlize Theron, who constantly go on about their, quote, transgender children. Women and men on the left who speak about this are usually ignored, silenced, punished, and/or threatened with cancellation and sometimes violence. I say this as a lifelong Democrat and a progressive feminist who strongly supports abortion rights and rights for lesbians and gay men. I registered to vote as a Democrat in 1990, and the only time since then that I have not been a Democrat was a brief period in the 2000s when I was registered Green. I re-registered as a Democrat to vote in the 2008 Democratic presidential primary and have remained a Democrat ever since. I'm also a radical feminist who has been following the, quote, transgender movement since 2014. During that time, I have learned a few things. When I say that Democrats have betrayed women and girls, I mean that Democrats in power, along with the cultural left, have allowed men and boys to compete on sports teams intended for women and girls, taking honors and awards that belong to women and girls, permitted convicted male felons to be housed in women's prisons with vulnerable women, and encouraged policies that permit men to invade women's intimate spaces like bathrooms, locker rooms, changing rooms, and spas. This all falls disproportionately on Black women and lesbians, both traditionally reliable Democratic voting blocs. They have promoted laws and policies that permit a corrupt medical establishment to feed puberty-blocking hormones, opposite-sex hormones, and surgeries to children and young people, causing sterility, illness, and other harms, including permanent loss of sexual and reproductive function. The deeply unfortunate truth is that the Democratic politicians, including many women, and the mainstream organized progressive movement, including historically feminist organizations, have entirely abandoned us and our society's children to the, quote, transgender lobby and the for-profit, quote, trans medical establishment. With some notable exceptions, the mainstream media has largely covered this up, which is why many of us don't understand it is happening. A lot of American Democratic women are concerned about these issues, but are uncomfortable talking about them because all opposition to, quote, trans seems to be coming from conservatives. That is understandable, but it's not true. I hear from rank and file Democrats, including progressives and feminists, every day, who say they are fed up with party leadership because of what they are doing on this issue. American liberal and progressive women and the men who care about them have every reason and right to be concerned about this issue and to talk about it with our voices and, if necessary, with our votes. It is, of course, only congressional Republicans who are taking steps to protect women's spaces in sports and to stop the sterilization and mutilation of healthy young people at the federal level, though some Democrats are taking similar steps at the state level, and only conservative media outlets that are having even slightly honest conversations about these things. But that's because congressional Democrats and liberal media outlets have allowed that to happen by refusing to step up on behalf of women and girls. If a single congressional Democrat would take it upon herself to say men are not women and should not have access to women's bathrooms, locker rooms, sports, or prisons, we would not be in this position. If you are worried about speaking out because you are concerned you will appear homophobic, don't be. Feminists and gay rights activists have been complaining for years now that the, quote, trans movement is itself homophobic. We argue that, quote, gender identity constitutes transing the gay away. By denying the material reality of sex, it denies the reality of same-sex attraction. For Pride Month 2023, the mayor of London declared, quote, Pride in London has helped to change our society. It's part of the reason London is renowned across the globe as a beacon of inclusion and diversity. I'm pleased that this year's campaign will be in support of the capital's trans and non-binary community, unquote. He didn't have a word to say about support for lesbians or gay men. The mayor of London is not even pretending that Pride is about gay rights anymore. Shortly after the mayor made that announcement, a group called Pride London started blocking lesbians and gay men who complained on X, of course, I mean what was formerly known as Twitter, about their exclusion from Pride. One UK lesbian remarked, quote, London Pride is determined to block all of the gay men and lesbians and welcome only the gender confused. There's nothing gay about Pride marches anymore. Pride is a traitor to sexuality, specifically same-sex attraction, unquote. American Democratic women, if you think of yourself as a supporter of gay rights, which I do, we need to pay very close attention to what is going on here. There's no reason to think something similar can't happen in the US. Okay, so then I tell a story about a lesbian woman named Julia Beck who earned a spot on something called the LGBTQ Commission in Baltimore. She complained about people who were referring to Karen White, of course, a man who was housed in a women's prison in the UK. And she said she refused to refer to Karen White as she. And eventually they kicked her off the commission. Quote, gender identity also disproportionately harms Black women, one of the Democrats' largest voting blocs, and in many ways uniquely. For example, it ignores the increased risks of violence that Black women face throughout society, denigrates Black women into harmful stereotypes of what it means to be a woman, and erases language that Black women use to describe their experiences of living in a society that is both profoundly sexist and racist. And later in the chapter on the victims, I have an entire section on Black women, how Black women are uniquely affected by this, and extensively quote the statement written by the WDI USA Black Women's Caucus, as well as a statement from Dr. Suzanne Vierling, who is here in the chat today. I'm going to skip ahead. I talk about 2 US women who have effectively been canceled in US academia. I introduce the concept of transwashing. The establishment left will tell you that, quote, trans people have always existed throughout history, and that there has been a, quote, decades-long movement to protect trans rights. Neither assertion is true, but it is a phenomenon that has come to be known as transwashing. That is, historical revisionism to paint historical figures and/or organizations as, quote, trans, when the individuals were more than likely lesbian or gay, and the organizations were more than likely gay rights groups. For example, a play premiered at Shakespeare's Globe Theatre in 2022 called I, Joan, in which a Joan of Arc character is portrayed as, quote, trans and non-binary. In one line, she says, "I'm not a girl. I do not fit that word." But Joan of Arc was certainly female, and there is evidence that she was likely a lesbian. The playwright is a woman named Charlie Josephine, who refers to herself as, quote, transgender, queer, and non-binary. In June 2023, New York Democratic State Senator Vlad Hoylman-Sigel posted, quote, on June 28, 1968, a crowd of mostly trans women of color rose up against state-sponsored bigotry at Stonewall Inn. 54 years later, LGBTQ New Yorkers continue to fight back, enacting our nation-leading legislation to protect trans youth and their families seeking gender-affirming care, unquote. This is not true. The Stonewall Rebellion was started by a lesbian and fought by lesbians and gay men at a time when the concept of trans women of color did not yet exist. Democrats and progressive organizations simply have to make us think that, quote, trans is a decades-long civil rights struggle to justify their efforts to allow men to invade women's spaces and poison children with dangerous hormones. Organizations like the ACLU and GLAAD have spent the past few years completely rewriting history in the US to portray decades worth of advocacy on behalf of lesbians and gay men as part of a decades-long, quote, trans rights movement. Transwashing is the complete rewriting of gay rights history and movement building, and it is blatantly homophobic. Then I talk a little bit about Target and the boycott that happened after Target put tucking materials front and center in its store. In the spring of 2022, a woman contacted me to say that she was very concerned about a student named Leah Thomas competing on the University of Pennsylvania women's swimming team. Her daughter was a swimmer on a different Ivy League team. The previous fall, she was looking at the season's roster and saw a senior named Leah Thomas on the Penn team. That surprised her because she had never seen a Leah Thomas on the Penn women's team. Where had Leah come from? Was Leah a transfer student? That seemed the likeliest explanation, but it also seemed odd because college students do not typically transfer as seniors. She looked into the matter and learned that Leah was a man named Will, who had previously competed and regularly lost on the Penn men's team. She did a little more digging and learned what many of us have known for several years. All over the country and the world, men are competing on women's sports teams on the basis of their supposed female gender identity and taking honors that are supposed to be reserved for women. She learned that the very category, women and girls, is being erased. She also learned that women who object to this are labeled transphobic or sometimes fascist or Nazi, even when we are progressive Democrats. This woman knew that Glamour magazine had named Caitlyn or Bruce Jenner Woman of the Year in 2015, and that Vanity Fair had put him on its cover, all of which she thought was pretty weird, but didn't stress it too much about. But she had no idea how pervasive this had become. She lamented, "I'm progressive on women's rights. I have voted for Democrats because of women's issues, and I have always believed we could count on Democrats not to abandon women. How could this happen without me even knowing about it?" That woman's name is Kim Jones, and today she is a co-founder of ICONS, the Independent Council on Women's Sports, which fights to keep women's sports for women. There are countless Democratic women like her all over the country. I'm going to skip to the end of the preface so I can get to the cautionary tale. This is the concluding paragraph of the preface. American Democratic and liberal and progressive women. We need to insist that our lawmakers represent our interests. We need to explain this to them in no uncertain terms. They have sold us out, and if they don't change course, they will be held accountable. Many leftist progressive women in the UK are stating publicly that they will not vote for the Labour Party or the Green Party until it stops throwing women under the bus at the altar of, quote, gender identity. Progressive feminists all over the world are doing the same with respect to their own so-called progressive parties. I won't tell anyone who to vote for, but I can say this. Unless Democrats change course immediately and publicly hold themselves accountable for what they have done to women and girls as a sex class, I have no plans to vote for them in 2024, and I am not alone. Okay, skipping to the afterword. A cautionary tale and a policy prescription for Democratic Party leadership. I'll read some parts of the cautionary tale, and I won't say too much about the policy prescription here today. Democratic Party leadership. You must change course, and you must do so immediately. You should do this because it's the right thing to do, but you should also do it for the health of the party. You only need to look at some of our allies across the pond and down under to understand why. Women all over the world are rejecting their left of center parties for refusing to represent our interests and for sacrificing women and children at the altar of, quote, gender identity. Google Nicola Sturgeon gender recognition if you want to understand what happens to politicians who ignore a bunch of angry Scottish feminists. At the end of this section, I'll suggest some policy changes you should start making immediately, but first I would like to offer a cautionary tale. All was quiet on the sex and gender front in the UK until, that is, it wasn't. Until women, including lesbians and many gay men, collectively said no to gender identity. When feminists started to complain, some leaders of the major left-leaning UK political parties started getting scared, and rightly so. These women and gay rights activists had it and weren't going to take it anymore. And then I go into the 2004 Gender Recognition Act, which I won't go into here, but then I say in July 2018, the UK government launched a consultation into reform of the Gender Recognition Act for England and Wales. Scottish, quote, reform discussed below would come later. And then I explain about the proposed changes to the Gender Recognition Act and explain why UK women were so angry about it. By then, discontent among feminists within the Labour Party due to tensions between women's rights and, quote, gender identity had been brewing for a while. In January 2018, a leftist feminist named Venice Allen was suspended from the Labour Party for alleged transphobia. Allen said at the time, quote, if stating that males are men means that Labour don't want me, quite frankly, I hope they chuck me out. Rather than wait for them to, quote, chuck her out, Allen left, stating that Labour was no longer a safe place for women. Allen wasn't alone. The UK government eventually decided in 2020 not to adopt the proposed, quote, reforms to the GRA, thanks in large part to the feminists who complained about it. That was a major win for UK women, but tensions between feminists and the Labour Party did not subside. In late September 2021, the UK Labour Party met for its annual conference. When asked by a news reporter, is it transphobic to say that only women have a cervix? Labour leader Keir Starmer said that that is something that, quote, should not be said. Doubling down, Labour member David Lammy later said that the statement, quote, only women have a cervix may not be transphobic, but it is not accurate. Lammy would go on to refer to feminists as dinosaurs who want to, quote, hoard rights. Needless to say, none of this went over very well with feminist members of the Labour Party who started mocking Lammy by wandering around London wearing dinosaur costumes. The hashtag Labour losing women has frequently trended on X over the course of the past several years, and an actual account called @LabourLosingWomen appeared in 2021 with the bio for Labour members and voters who won't support them whilst they continue to ignore the concerns of women. And then I have a few more things to say about labor. I go into talking about Rosie Duffield. I quote Suzanne Moore in The Guardian, where Suzanne published a piece titled, "Keir Starmer's mishandling of the trans debate is an open goal for the Tories. Women's right to single-sex spaces either matters to the Labour leadership or it doesn't. They cannot have it both ways." Then we go into I talk about the Green Party, I talk about Emma Bateman, I talk about what's going on in Australia. And by the end of this section, and I talk extensively about Scotland. And the section concludes, I'm looking for a part where I quote Raquel, and I'm not finding it. But in any event, the section concludes, "I have met many of the feminist women who are campaigning against, quote, gender identity all over the world. They are fierce, outspoken feminists, and they all have their political roots in traditional leftist politics. It remains to be seen whether any left-leaning party leaders in the UK or elsewhere will survive their steadfast refusal to engage in any good faith discussions with feminists within their own parties about how gender identity, by denying the material reality of sex, affects women's lives. Democrats in positions of leadership are unlikely to fare any better unless they take steps to make amends." And then the very final paragraph of the book says this: "Democrats in power, you have done wrong by American women and girls, and you know it. You have betrayed us, and it is time to come clean. It is time for the abolition of sex to end. The year 2024 is right around the corner, and you need to right this ship. In August 2023, the Republican National Committee adopted a resolution to, quote, protect children from unsafe sex trait modification and experimentation. Their resolution states that sex trait modification procedures, including puberty blockers, wrong sex hormones, and, quote, gender-affirming surgeries, are permanent, risky, and experimental with potential harms, including infertility, low bone density, and heart disease. The stated aim of its sponsor is to incorporate this resolution into the 2024 Republican Party platform. You have allowed the Republican Party to become the party of sanity and child safeguarding. You have allowed the Republican Party to become the party of protecting women. You have lost the trust of millions of rank and file Democrats. To regain trust among Democratic voters of both sexes, you need to hold yourself accountable and publicly concede defeat on this issue. 2024 depends on it. Good luck."
Have you had much response so far from any sort of mainstream media or people inviting you on to discuss it?
So I'm working with the publicist within the publishing company, and we're talking behind the scenes about who will want to talk about it. I have a few interviews scheduled coming up and a few that we're just waiting to schedule.
I mean, I would imagine there's a loads of women and men who do feel betrayed. They've given their lives to the Democrats and feel confused by it. So hopefully lots of them will read it.
That's the hope. One of the things that I think about a lot is I think that, unfortunately, first of all, I really wish that the Supreme Court had not overturned Roe v. Wade for obvious reasons. WIDI's USA's position on abortion is not unclear at all. We unconditionally support abortion rights. But I also think it's deeply unfortunate that the Supreme Court basically did Democrats a huge favor by overturning Roe v. Wade, because there are so many Democrats, especially women in this country, who would abandon the Democratic Party on this issue, but will still feel compelled to vote Democrat. And I understand why, to protect abortion rights. I get it. So we're just in an absolutely untenable position. The name of it is The Reckoning: How the Democrats and the Left Betrayed Women and Girls. As of now, it's only on Amazon. I understand that's very controversial. A lot of people don't like Amazon. That was the decision of the publisher to put it on Amazon. So please go to Amazon, The Reckoning: How the Democrats and the Left Betrayed Women and Girls. And if you are able to read it, please leave a review. I welcome criticism, especially if you want to leave a positive review, but negative reviews are welcome too. Constructive criticism is very welcome.